Hey guys, a lot of people this expansion have been saying control is dead. You probably heard this. You can't play control decks, either aggro or OTK. Control is a dead archetype. Thanks, developers. I just want to play control. And then you have other people say, no, control's alive. What are you talking about? There's so many control decks. You just don't want to play a deck with no win condition. And I want to talk about what I think control is and is control alive. But just to show you some things we have. I liked this tweet where it says control isn't dead in Hearthstone. You can still control the cards in your hand with a click of the button. You've got Brian Kibler kind of saying, I get a lot of people like these combo styles decks, but he just doesn't like the late game interaction, and many sort of crowds out a lot of the other sort of slower strategies. He doesn't use that exact language. That's what he said. Trump's video, it said control is dead. I healed for 80. And we have Zeddy with a why control is dead in Hearthstone video. And I think we had on the XR MMA AMA Jay Alexander said, what you call Quest Shaman and Quest Mage control decks. I think both Jay Alexander and a lot of people at Vicious and Syndicate were saying, no, these are control decks. They're controlling the board, right? And I think his saying is either fatigue or decks that get proactive in the late game with large minions is primarily the win condition of control decks. But I think what's interesting, and before I go, I don't think control is completely a 1-0 thing. And realistically, almost all decks use a variety of strategies to win. So they might win through control, and actually a lot of decks will I'm going to go through some decks in a minute, what I think, how much they're control, how much they're aggro, how much they're burn, how much they're combo, how much they're anti-control. I don't think it's a 1-0 thing. But that being said, what do I think? Do I think control is dead? And I'm going to go with mostly dead.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead. There's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead.
So what I mean by mostly dead is it's a very weak archetype that only can exist in certain pocket metas when basically Quest Mage isn't being played that much. But that means it still does exist, and you can still play it and have success with control on ladder. And I think if you go with a deck that it's mostly control but with a little bit hybrid, you can do well. And there's only a few decks that are like that, but I'm going to go through some decks. So here we've got some of the different decks and what I would consider them. So we've got controller, and this is the most pure control deck out there, I would say. Super late game, slow value, defensive tools, lots of defense, combo disruption. You can see, it's got mutinous to potentially disrupt a quest or a large minion. It's got the sort of the big late game defensive value of overload that's very slow. It's got lots of value. It's got cards that draw cards, and it's slow value based, and it has the very big but slow. Rattlegore is a card you play, and it doesn't kill you fast at all. It kills you very slowly. So the deck still has to continuously control the board in order to win with Rattlegore. If you play, if I play Rattlegore, and then you play a bunch of Overlord Saurfang and or let's the bunch of 5/5s, for example, and I don't have a way to deal with it. Let's say I've already used my Brawl, I've already used my Bladestorm. Well, I might take me 4 hits on your face with Rattlegore to win, but then you just hit me in the face and win. So I still have to control, and I think that's one of the key elements. It's not I delay until I get my powerful engine going and then I just kill you. But yeah, I think this is probably 100% control. This is the pure example of a control deck. Late game value, defensive tools, some disruption, primarily winning through defense and health gain. So removing the board, gaining health, and a very slow late game value. This is the archetype, and I've looked at the stats, and we'll go into some of those later. This deck in the last week at Legend has a 49% win rate. That's tier 3. You can play this deck because Baroque Rogue is so prevalent at Legend. Actually, Diamond Legend is a lot worse, and it's not because I think this deck is harder. but Quest Mage is actually very common on the climb to Legend. But if you're just at Legend, Quest Mage actually goes down a little bit, and it's actually a very solid deck. Overall, it's not tier 2, but it's solid. You can play it. It has tournament legitimacy. So, control isn't dead, but the reality, I think what's hard about, if you're playing this deck, all of a sudden this deck gets a little bit popular, bam, Quest Mage explodes, and this deck is garbage again. And that's the reality of why control kind of is mostly dead. It can only be alive for a little bit. So next I want to go through a deck that is, I consider, mostly control, but it's a few other things too. So we got Fel DH, and this is less about the late game minions, but it is very, very defensive. It is primarily winning through defensive means. It will beat aggro decks. It doesn't really need to have win condition often, but still, it's not really, I wouldn't consider the anti-control of some of these other decks. It's burn mixed with control. So it's less about the late game value slow, but it's more about playing the defense. But you have to set up your Jace, and your opponent, it's also very value based, like getting enough value out of your Jace, getting enough value, and you can sort of wait to combo cards, and it has a slight combo element. You could still get Il'gynoth and win with that. You can run, but the reality is this isn't the infinite powerhouse that is Quest. So I wouldn't consider this anti-control. I'd mix it with a mix of control and burn. So burn is kind of a form of aggro. It's not board-based aggro. So there's board-based aggro, I call it, and burn-based aggro. And certain decks are mixed. This is really pure burn and control. And definitely, I really like this deck. It's very enjoyable to play. And if you like control archetypes, I think you'll like this deck a lot. It's not the slow, like I play a bunch of clowns or a Ralgor. It's not this minions based, and I think that minions based or fatigue is primarily like the still like I have to control the board where and there's still you need to control the board, but realistically you could be really behind on board, and if your opponent doesn't have a taunt, you could go Jace for an OTK. So there's still kind of that racy burnout that makes it's not quite a pure control deck. Or even a prep, but it's still, I think, a large part control. It's probably one of the most control-y decks that's actually good in the meta. But it's still, I wouldn't consider pure control. I would actually, yeah, I would put Fel DH as, I'd say, like 60% control, 30% burn, and like 10% combo. Because once in a while you win with those, but most of it is burn and like a partial combo. So next we got Quest Mage. And Quest Mage, I think people say is control, and it's not. Realistically, it controls the board, but even when it's controlling the board, it's primarily trying to get its quest done and discount. So it's actually trying to set up its late game win condition. And interestingly enough, the control tools are actually incredibly strong, and this I'm going to talk about later. But you've got part of the reason this deck can exist is First Flame, Fire Sale. These cards are ridiculously good. And then you've got Ignite, which is infinite value. So what I consider this deck to truly be is not a control deck, but an anti-control deck. And what this means is, and the most famous anti-control deck of all time, I'd say, at least in my time, is Quest Rogue, or the old Quest Rogue, not the current Quest Rogue, where the deck would just continuously put out 4/4s or 5/5s before I even played the game, because I kind of started right after Angora and Frozen Throne. I would put out 4/4s over and over and over again. And if you were a value-based control deck, like Control Warlock, basically the only chance you had is if your opponent messed up, because they just would play 4/4s over and over. They would use Zola on itself and just keep making 4/4s forever. And a value-based deck just could not win because it just was just so infinite, both the value and the tempo. So I think people think about infinite value, but they don't realize the efficient tempo. If I have infinite 10 mana 10/10s with no taunt and no effect, that's not going to be very good. But if I have infinite 4/4s that cost 1 mana, that's going to be insane. And not going to question Rogue, but the reality is there's a big difference between infinite value and efficient infinite value. And Quest Mage is incredibly efficient. Once it gets its quest off, it has 2 mana, draw 4, or even more if you have Primordial Studies, and it has ignites that keep shuffling in your deck that do more and more and more damage. Fire Sale can do 6 damage to all minions to easily clear a board for 4, so it just gets hyper efficient, and any control deck just can't keep up with the tempo or the value of the deck. It has infinite value, and its tempo is too efficient. So a deck that might have infinite value, maybe a very often the old Control Priest from last expansion. Well, you could still out tempo it sometimes. If you ran them out of their efficient removal, they might run out of that form of value, and they would have all these sort of clunky minions. But you would just have a board advantage, and you could press that board advantage for a win. With this deck, the reality is it's just going to be so hard to get a tempo advantage. So even if they don't have quite enough burn or you have armor, you're just not going to be able to outrace them because they're just too efficient. That's why it's a very anti-control, and on top of that, it never runs out of stuff. So this makes it, because it's infinite value, a hyper-efficient tempo. It just absolutely annihilates control decks. That's why I would consider it an anti-control archetype. And just interestingly enough, the way certain decks that are really strong in the meta, Aggro Druid, are unfavored against this deck because this deck annihilates board. The one weakness of this deck, which is what the meta is kind of warping to, so even though this deck isn't, I don't think, is much lower tier than the other decks, the meta is slightly warped around it, where decks like Garrote Rogue, decks like Poison Rogue, decks like Base Hunter that barely use minions, because the minions, remember, get owned by the First Flame and the Fire Sale, but primarily use Burn, which Mage doesn't have a good time of dealing with because the only health gain they have is Ice Barrier, requires you hitting them in the face. Those are the decks that beat this deck, and that's kind of what the meta is warped around. So yeah, I would consider this a anti-control / burn deck. It wins through burn, but it just has infinite value and infinite and hyper efficient tempo, which is just something that control decks can't deal with at all. There's just no chance. If you're playing control against a real control warrior, not Big Warrior. Big Warrior has a chance against Quest Mage. It's real bad, but it's not pure control element of Quest Mage. If you're playing a pure control, you're not going to survive round, but even if you get 60 armor and the 3 mana weapon, they're still just going to keep throwing ignites at your face, and eventually they will get through. And your Rattlegore just won't get there fast enough. And even then, they might just say, "Oh, I just randomly generated an evolving missile." So even that. So the reality is, Quest Mage just is the ultimate anti-control deck, and this is the kind of deck that basically makes control unplayable. And the only time control can be played is people start playing a little less of this deck, then people can start sneaking control. But the moment it gets even a small percentage of the meta, Quest Mage becomes good again, and then bam. The more pure, slow-based, control-based value deck just gets annihilated. And finally, we got one of what I consider the best deck in the game is Garrote Rogue. And I think people think of this deck as a combo deck. And I like putting this example in because it's so people are thinking this deck is linear, and it's not. It has so many different ways to win, and different matchups it will play differently. So this deck can be literally everything. If you're playing the primary ways was combo. Oh, get my Garrotes in combo. Okay, but what else can it win with? It can win with tempo. It can just, especially with Kazakus, you just get a big board. Half the decks in the game won't be able to deal with that. You maybe buff your board with a Kazakus Golem, or you just get some Divine Shield Kazakus minions. You can win with just that, and that can be enough. It can be it can be it can be a aggro, or we said it can be a control deck. And so if you're playing against Base Hunter, for example, well, I might one of the main ways you can win with Base Hunter if you're running Kazakus is you go Kazakus into the 5/5 Golem, and you get Lifesteal. You get 2/5/5, and that's enough to just out heal the Face Hunter, and you might not need that much, but that just is enough that they run out of resources, and then you play some minions and you kill them. That's a very common way to to win against Face Hunter with this deck. And that's a more control based, like I'm going to out resources them, I'm going to defend, and I'm going to win in the late game. So I said it can also win with aggro. So if you're playing against Druid, often because of Celestial Alignment, going for the OTK is not a reliable win condition. So what you actually do is you play minutes, you might even tempo your Ethereal Aug Merchants, you might tempo, you tempo, just try and get a big board. If they go and then just kill them and slow them down with Cold Neophytes before they can get their sort of hyper late game value engine going. So I think this is the show that just because a deck, I want to say, but I would not consider this a control deck. I would consider primarily a combo / tempo deck. But that being said, just because a deck, when I wanted to put this deck in there to say almost all decks do some form of control. They control the board. That does not make the deck a control deck. It's more about sort of how it wins primarily. But I really like this deck, but it does sometimes play control, and that's what's interesting. So next I want to talk about sort of what I think actually could help the meta. What is actually going wrong? And I have kind of three main things I think could help the meta. I'm going to go and say control is actually too strong. What I mean is the defensive tools of control are insane. And I think people think control stinks, and it's actually because control tools are so good, it basically makes it so, and then we've got the combo. So if you look at the last meta with Priest, and it was until Priest was nerfed, it was a very control heavy meta, and it was then it became about out greeting each other. And the fact that decks could be so greedy was because control was so effective. And they just said, so basically once you're winning and crushing aggro, you get more greedier to beat the other control decks. So I want to just even go in like some of the cards that are just so insanely good in this meta. So like Demon Hunter has some really good cards that are just, I'm even skipping over some good ones, but just want to go through I-Beam, insanely good card that's been around for a while. And we have Immolation Orb. Like these are really, really good cards that just kind of shut down board-based aggro. So Demon Hunter just can so easily deal with board-based aggro that they're able to play these greedy, slow quest decks because they're so effectively able to stop aggro. That's what can be so strong with Demon Hunter. And so reality is it's just very hard for aggro deck to kind of spiral because there's so many other ways. Let's go back. Next I want to go through Mage. Mage has some really powerful cards, and one is not even running Devolving Missiles. Insanely good card that isn't even seeing play right now, mainly because it doesn't advance the quest. But if the meta warped it up, Mage would run it. It's got First Flame, and it's got Fire Sale. And even Fire Sale, not only is it an incredibly efficient removal at 4 mana, but on top of it, it's tradable. So I can just say, I'm not playing 8 aggro matchup, get out of my deck. That's part of what makes it so good. So Mage, very, very strong defensive tools on the board specifically. It's not as good, like I said, the one weakness is burn. Either weapon burn or just spell burn. But the board is very easy for Mage to deal with. Next, I want to just highlight one card, Coerce. Very, very strong card, used in Poison Rogue, we also have, compared to Assassinate, we're kind of the power level, how removal has gotten so insane. Assassinate used to be 5 mana, and now it's 4. And there used to be even Walk the Plank that was 4 mana, destroy an undamaged minion. Reality is a single target removal is insane. So you just can't, it's very hard to stick a minion. And then on top of it, like Rogue has, Brain Freeze and Prize Plunder. They're both not the sort of typical decks a control deck would run, but just insanely strong removal. Next, Shaman. Shaman has the Perpetual Flame that was just nerfed. That's still a very strong card, but Sorry. That's still a... Oh, I forgot I disenchanted it. I have not played. But Shaman has the Perpetual Flame. That's still very strong. But it's not, it went to 2 mana, with, especially with the quest synergy. But just like being able to completely annihilate an entire board with 1 card, and then even have it help your quest, very, very good. And Warlock has the 1 mana, Touch of Nerethium. This card is absolutely insane. I rated it as a 4. Just like damage and heal. It's just so efficient. Compare that to Renew, which while you get to discover, I said in 2 mana. Now old Renew is really good, but 2 mana I heal for 3 and I discover. Where this kills something, heals for 4. Look at that incredible efficiency. And then it also has the very powerful Soul Rend, which before the problem with Soul Rend, well, it hurt you because you needed the value because it was a control heavy meta. Now with the anti-control abilities of Warlock, which I didn't go as much into, you don't need the value. So the fact is, Soul Rend very, very strong. So, and then even Warrior has cards like Rancor that just not only can destroy a board but make you suffer for it. Like they go Rancor and you lose your board. And all these cards, what it makes it do is it makes board not a solid strategy. Because, well, like if I'm playing Garrote Rogue versus Warrior, I actually make a big board, and I actually can just, hey, I just gave you 14 armor because I played minions. So the reality is removal, or if I'm playing against Mage, hey, I played a minion. Now, not only did you remove my minion, but you completed your quest. Oh, I'm playing against a Warlock. Oh, you actually were able to free up hand space and heal because I played a 2/2 with the touch. There's a lot of these examples in the current meta, and what it leads to this is very few decks play for board. So interestingly enough, now if, for example, let's say before, if you look at old Quest Rogue, the deck got stomped by aggro. Look at Quest Mage for difference. It does not lose to aggro, it loses to burn, specifically a form of aggro. So, but actual board-based aggro decks, it's not bad against at all, or if it's even favored. For example, Aggro, which is one of the best decks in the game, it's actually favored against. So the reality is that defensive tools are absolutely insane. Next, I want to go, and probably should be weakened across the board, but realistically, they've all been basically made stronger across the board, so I don't expect that to be a realistic thing, but my next solution, I think, kind of compensates for that. So the next is board-based aggro is not strong enough. And I was very sad when cards like Battlegrounds Battlemaster, I really like this card, and it really rewarded board-based aggro. So what does that mean? It rewarded players for having board, and if you had a powerful board, you could kill your opponent off. And it made boards actual threats. Because the hard thing is, like I said, you make a big board, Brawl, a Rancor, a Arcanist plus Immolation, or very easy to deal with. But if every board becomes a threat, it changes the game. So for a while, you had Paladin doing well, you had Quest Rogue doing well, you had a lot of these board-based decks still doing good. But this was a nerf that it was largely nerf for Quest Warlock with the Flesh Giants, but it was also in a lot of decks, and it made board-based aggro. Now, it's still a good card, but it's not as much punishing. It's a lot harder for these sort of faster aggro decks to use it, and it's more useful for slow, big minions, mainly Warlock with Giants or decks with Giants. So this was a card that was good. Then there was a Crab Rider, which was a very strong card that you could win games with. And you could play it, and if your opponent didn't remove it or neglected to remove it, maybe you buffed it up. Maybe you buffed it up before you put it out there. Maybe you buffed it up with something like Rakara. But this card could win games. And you might say, this card was too strong, I was losing too many games to it. But the reality, without that aggro pressure, without that, these minions on board are going to kill you. Decks can be greedier and greedier. So it doesn't feel good to lose to Crab Rider. Well, okay, we nerf all these decks, which is what has happened, which is the feedback, And then all of a sudden, well, there's no way for boards to win, so all these greedy OTK anti-control decks like Quest Mage do really well. So it's a thing of, I think having powerful minions, not just burn, but minions that actually do stuff and that actually dual damage, that are actually legitimate threats to your opponent. And maybe I'd like to see more cards like Bear Shark that are difficult to remove. Maybe even new mechanics. I've thought about something saying like can't be targeted by battle cries. Maybe it's like a card sort of like Cloak, or maybe it says cards that target minions cost more. There could be lots of things like this. But just basically making cards that are both more resilient to removal, but also more punishing for players to just neglect. If the quest, you want to make it so, if the quest DH, they decide to not remove your minion because they want to, progress their quest for the turn. Well, all of a sudden that minion just crushes them. And you want to make these combo decks, these greedy sort of late game win conditions that have that compromise. And without that compromise, control can't exist, because what happens is when these powerful aggro decks are a thing, well, then a deck kind of that says, I'm going to really focus on defense. I'm going to really focus on stopping this at the expense of some of my late game win conditions. So maybe I have some big stuff, but I don't have the raw efficiency that is Quest Lifesteal DH or Quest Mage or Quest Warlock. You have that compromise. And I think having powerful aggro tools, the fact that even aggro Druid isn't even favored against Quest Mage is crazy. Just the reality is board-based strategies of aggression just aren't very good in a world where removal is so good. So if they don't make removal worse, I really think I'd like to see board-based. And I think cards that I do like that are seeing play that were even nerfed are the Watch Posts. I think I really like that these cards exist. And these aren't quite aggression, but what they do is they say they punish decks for not fighting for board and for ignoring board, that without just doing damage. Because the reality is, well, if I'm playing Spell DH and you play some minions, you put me down to 10 health, bam, I do Morg, Arcanist, Fellscream Blast, I full heal, and remove your board. That happens all the time. The reality is, well, all that damage, but the Watch Post can actually really slow decks down and punish decks. So I really liked these cards in the last meta. But I think, decks that are really good against these are like Rush Warrior. So I would like to see kind of cards in this realm of just saying, hey, you're just going to ignore board. Life's going to be difficult for you. And I think that will help the pure control decks, and it will hurt the solitaire decks. And the last thing I'd like to see is more, and I talked about this in my last video, more ways to disrupt. Watch Post is a way of disrupting. Glide is a way of disrupting, but more things that say, I'm going to slow down your win condition. I'm going to, or stop your win condition. Mutinous is the most common disruptive tool, but in reality is it is too slow. It just at 7/7, people play the quest on 6, or if they know you have a mutinous, they just wait and and the reality. So I'd like more effective ways to disrupt, and ideally you make ways to slow down that don't just, I think the criticism of disruption, you have something like an Ooze or a Lucia, it just becomes a purely 1-0. But often what I find interesting when I play Garrote Rogue versus Demon Hunter, often I'll have a read that they definitely have Glide in hand. They have a kept card on their left, and I'll lower the hand, and all of a sudden they're at 7 cards, and they decide, do I even want to play Glide? Because my opponent has 4 cards in hand, because they just dumped their hand. And I think that could be really interesting. I think that can add a really interesting dynamic to the game. So it's hard to find the line of disruption cards that aren't just hyper polarizing, where ideally you want disruption cards that are kind of good overall, that are even better when they disrupt, and they offer counterplay. So I think Glide is my favorite example. You can dump cards. You could say, okay, if I'm playing Quest Warlock, I'm going to be much more hesitant to just go backfire. And I think that interactivity adds a lot to the game. So I think Glide's honestly one of my favorite cards in the current meta. Actually, in Celestial Alignment, I like a lot too. Let's go to that card. This is a card that is very easily punished by aggro, but it's a card that adds a lot of interactivity. Do I hold back my Efficient Octobot and wait? Do I hold back my Incanter's Flow? Do I commit to board? Oh, do I dump my hand? Do I assume they don't have Celestial Alignment for a turn? Do I have to play the Cold Neophyte here? Do I wait? I think this card's a very good interactive sort of disruption card that I really like as well in the meta. And this card was really, really bad in the previous meta because there's nothing to disrupt. So I like these cards that kind of both glide and Celestial Alignment were cards that people thought were going to be good and they were bad because there just wasn't anything to disrupt. And then on top of it, they have initial value themselves. So these kind of cards, I think, add a huge amount to the meta, and they're natural counters, and they're actually interesting decks. Like Quest Demon Hunter is a very interesting deck. Quest Lifesteal Demon is an interesting deck. And a Conjure Druid, I think, is a really fun, interesting deck. The alignment timing, when you can pop off it, I think these decks add a lot to the meta and are natural counters to some of these solitaire-ish decks. So I think more cards like this and getting the design right, because the idea is that, you know, some just very purely sort of hyper polarizing cards that, you know, are maybe really bad in some matchups and not. But I think this idea is really good. So that's what I'd like to see overall. I'd like for removal and control tools to actually get weaker, to incentivize decks to have to play more control tools, makes it harder for them in late game win conditions. So I'd like aggro to get stronger. I'd like, specifically board base as opposed to burn base. So I think thing like Space Hunter has actually very, very efficient and powerful burn cards. But I'd like to see more board base. I'd like to see minions on board, punishing opponents and winning games, and saying, hey, you better be a little less greedy and actually be able to deal with minions. That will allow control-based attrition strategies because they're allowed to be a little bit slower and be a little more defensive. That makes it harder for these greedy quests to win. And third, I would like there to be more disruption tools. So those are kind of what I think the meta needs. You know, there's a mini expansion. If you're a dev, feel free to take this and use these ideas. So, but I think that's where I'd like to see the game go. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more of this sort of less gameplay content, more what I think the game needs. One last thing I wanted to talk about is I think the danger of just purely deleting the quest decks. So if you actually look at the meta, the reality, and this is kind of what I was saying, if we look at something like Control Warrior, like Fel DH, which are, I consider, even though Fel DH is not a complete control deck the way I'd say Control Warrior is, I would say it's definitely hybrid control. Control is a big wave it wins. If you actually look at it, it annihilates some of these aggro decks. Look, 70% against aggro Druid, 77 against Face Hunter, 75 against aggro Shadow Priest, 65 against Elemental Shaman. A lot of these tempo-based board decks just get annihilated by this deck, and that's not necessarily completely bad. But like the reality is, if you didn't have quest decks, which you might actually have, which would be funny, is everybody saying, now you still might have Garrote Rogue just absolutely did not dominating, but you might, you know, if you didn't have these powerful late game deck, you might be saying, and this was last expansion, control is too strong, aggro doesn't stand a chance, is aggro dead? So if we were just to delete quest completely and delete this kind of late game value style, we might have just shifting the problem to another spot. So that's why I'd like I said, control to be a viable archetype without necessarily deleting these late game powerhouse strategies, to have more counterplay and to have more incentives for control to make control in the meta better. So that's kind of my opinions on that. So I hope you guys find that interesting, and yeah, hope to see you guys soon.